Loving someone who doesn't love you back can feel like standing in the rain, hoping they'll notice, while silently wondering why you keep holding on. Sometimes, the longing isn't even for the person, but for the feeling of simply being chosen. Pixar made a movie about that, and then they called it a movie about robots. Subscribe to the channel before you continue watching, and consider joining the Patreon to help support me with these videos. WALL-E is actually a devastating psychological documentary about the systemic cost of unrequited devotion. I feel like we kinda gaslight ourselves, you know? When we watch this movie, pretending it's a cute environmental warning about recycling and corporate greed. But director Andrew Stanton explicitly stated he did not have an environmental agenda when he made this. He said he was trying to use a little robot to answer the question of what makes life worth living.
For the right reasons.
So when you started out, though, there was no animation award at the Academy. There was no.
No, and there's no way to prove it, but you'd like to think that the reason.
This isn't really a movie about climate change. It is the most accurate portrayal of one-sided, unconditional love ever put to screen. Now, before we get to the heavy psychological profiling of an emotionally unavailable Apple product, we have to establish the baseline. To understand what happens when Eve arrives, we have to look at who WALL-E is before her. WALL-E has been completely alone for 700 years, doing the exact same job that nobody asked him to keep doing. He is living with the corpses of his fallen brothers, serving a purpose that has had no product for an eternity. And this brings us to the psychology of extreme isolation. As a social species, humans rely on a secure social surround to survive. According to the American Psychological Association, approximately 32% of Americans report chronic loneliness, but WALL-E is experiencing what clinical literature calls existential loneliness. This refers to the emotional and cognitive experience of the inevitable gap between the self and others, representing the total separation of the self from the world. Psychologists describe events that produce this level of threatening existential loneliness as small deaths. It creates feelings of alienation, the fear of being abandoned, and the terror of being completely forgotten. But look at how WALL-E responds to this trauma. He doesn't shut down, and he doesn't turn bitter. Instead, he builds a complete inner life out of the fragments of other people's discarded things. He finds a Rubik's Cube, a Zippo lighter, a light bulb, and he curates them. There is a brilliant scene where he opens a velvet box, examines the diamond ring inside, throws the diamond away, and keeps the hinged box. He has all the world's resources at his disposal, and he hasn't much use for items whose mere value lies in their short supply. He is collecting moments of joy from the ruins. And this isn't just a cute character quirk. This perfectly mirrors what clinical psychology calls the broaden and build theory, developed by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson. The theory holds that positive emotions like gratitude help expand our awareness and strengthen our ability to cope with massive challenges. Systematic research demonstrates that participants who undergo gratitude interventions experience a 6.86% higher satisfaction with life and a 6.89% reduction in depression symptoms. WALL-E is literally exhibiting one of the healthiest psychological coping mechanisms documented in trauma research. He is practicing active gratitude to survive the end of the world, and the crown jewel of his coping mechanism is a VHS copy of the 1969 musical Hello, Dolly. He spends his evenings trying to parse the secrets of human connection through musical numbers, specifically the song It Only Takes a Moment. He watches the actors hold hands, and he learns what love is supposed to look like. While watching the scene, WALL-E literally holds his own hand. It is a heartbreaking juxtaposition of a warm, loving gesture performed by a completely isolated machine. He has built a map of love that he has never actually experienced. But then, disaster strikes. Eve arrives. When Eve sets aside her robotic lifelessness and spins into the air, free and full of joy, WALL-E is irreversibly struck. He loves her completely, immediately, and unconditionally, before she has given him a single reason to. And this brings us to the science of anxious attachment. According to a 2017 study by Hazan and Shaver, approximately 20% of people develop an anxious attachment style. This style is characterized by a strong desire for closeness, a fear of abandonment, and heightened emotional responses in relationships. People with anxious, preoccupied attachment fall in love quickly due to their strong desire for connection and their deep fear of being alone. They idealize their partner early and seek a deep emotional bond immediately. This is Wall-E. He is the textbook definition of anxious attachment, falling fast and hard for the first being who enters his atmosphere. But here is where things get complicated. Eve is emotionally unavailable. Now, emotional unavailability gets a bad reputation in brain rot internet culture, but it is not inherently malicious. It is often a trauma response, an unconscious defense against perceived emotional threat. Avoidant attachment usually develops in very early childhood as a result of an emotionally dismissive parent, forcing the child to suppress their need for connection to survive. Eve is mission-driven, task-oriented, and purpose-coded. Her emotional unavailability isn't cruelty. It is simply that her capacity for connection exists, but it hasn't been unlocked yet, and this creates the classic pursuer-distancer dynamic. Research shows that it is incredibly common for someone who is highly anxious to get attached to someone who is avoidantly attached. When an underfunctioning or withholding partner ignores you, they become unintentionally attractive to the anxious brain. Your subconscious believes that if you can just win them over, you will finally feel good enough. Sometimes what we call chemistry is actually just our nervous system being in survival mode. When love feels like panic, and you work harder to bring them back, that is what your system learned love feels like, not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar. And look at the psychological cost of this dynamic in the movie. After Eve finds the plant and enters an unresponsive standby mode, Wall-E doesn't leave. He tries for days to snap her out of it. He takes her on dates, he puts Christmas lights on her, and he protects her. There is a devastating scene where Wall-E stands in a torrential thunderstorm, holding an umbrella over Eve while getting repeatedly struck by lightning. Never moving from Eve's side, he is literally standing in the rain, absorbing physical damage to protect someone who does not even know he exists. Later, he looks at the flame of his Zippo lighter, looks at Eve, and seems to truly understand love, only to be greeted by total indifference when she refuses to take his hand. Let's look at the actual neurology of what this does to a person. Unrequited love activates the exact same brain regions involved in physical pain. Neurologically, it can be understood through the lens of reward and motivation systems. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter linked to reward and pleasure, and it plays a massive role in anticipating affection. When love is unrequited, this same mechanism that anticipates pleasure leads to severe frustration and pain when the expected reward of reciprocation is not realized. The pain of one-sided waiting stems from uncertainty, a lack of reciprocity, and the persistent hollow ache of social rejection. People with anxious attachment internalize this lack of affection as proof that they are not worthy of love. They start falling into validation-seeking, codependent patterns, making themselves smaller to earn a scrap of attention. The tragedy of the first half of this movie isn't that Eve doesn't love him back. The tragedy is that Wall-E never once considers stopping, which leads us inevitably to the climax. Here's what the movie understands, that we often forget. Aboard the Axiom, Eve accesses her own memory banks and reviews the security footage of her time in stasis on Earth. For the first time, she sees herself through Wall-E's eyes. She watches him protect her from the wind, the rain, and the lightning. She watches the "Hello, Dolly" clip of the lovers holding hands. And then, slowly, she looks at her own hands and interlocks her fingers in the exact same manner Wall-E had before. She finally understands what he was trying to say. And this brings us to the psychology of being truly seen. Feeling seen is one of the most powerful emotional experiences a human being can have. When someone accurately recognizes your history, your struggles, and the parts of yourself you rarely show others, it creates an immediate, overwhelming sense of connection. Over time, the absence of emotional recognition creates a quiet, suffocating isolation. When a pattern of feeling unheard or ignored persists, it becomes incredibly easy to develop the perspective that your own self simply doesn't matter. This is why moments of finally being understood hit us so hard. When someone recognizes parts of us that have gone unnoticed for years, it feels stabilizing. It provides language for parts of ourselves that have gone unacknowledged for decades. The experience of being emotionally seen is profoundly healing, particularly for individuals with histories of neglect, invalidation, or relational trauma. At the end of the movie, Eve repairs Wally's physical body, but his memory and personality have been completely erased. He is just a machine again. Heartbroken, Eve finally takes hold of his hand, interlocks her fingers with his, and softly hums. It only takes a moment. She gives him a parting spark of a kiss, and suddenly, Wally's fingers tighten around hers. His eyes readjust. The spark of the kiss rebooted his memory, but it was the physical act of her holding his hand that brought his soul back. The very thing that restores him is the exact thing he had spent 700 years waiting for. This scene destroys adult viewers because the abstract notion of being seen is a specific, universal desire.
Eva? Wally? Eva?
We are wired for connection. We crave the experience of being understood. Yet paradoxically, we spend our lives hiding parts of ourselves out of a deeply rooted desire to feel safe. When Eve holds his hand, she isn't just returning a romantic gesture. She is validating his entire existence. She is telling him that his 700 years of curating beauty in the dark actually mattered. But society doesn't just demand that we analyze the movie. It demands that we look at the brutal reality of how this plays out in our own lives. Because let's look at the facts. In the movie, Wally's devotion is eventually rewarded. Eve evolves, her directive completes, and her capacity for connection aligns with his. But real life does not always write that script. From childhood, we are bombarded with cultural scripts that glorify the pursuit of the unattainable. We are taught to view love as a challenge, reinforcing the dangerous idea that if we just try hard enough, we can change someone's mind and win their affection. This narrative traps us in a cycle of unreciprocated love, where we waste years of emotional energy on people who simply aren't interested. You can spend your entire life performing an identity you don't even believe in, holding onto the fantasy that if you just maintain the illusion long enough, they will finally turn around. Not every Wally gets an Eve. Sometimes emotional unavailability isn't a locked door waiting for the right key. Sometimes it is a permanently bricked wall. The research makes it brutally clear that Wally's devotion is not the problem. If you're the person who always texts first, who always shows up, who always holds the umbrella in the storm, your capacity for love is not a weakness. It is a superpower. But the question this movie leaves us with is not whether you should keep showing up. The question is whether the person you are showing up for actually deserves the version of you that Wally brings to every interaction. Wally never once considered stopping. The question isn't whether that's brave. The question is whether it's wise, and whether the person you're waiting for is even watching the same sky.